At the beginning of 1982, Argentina was ruled by a military dictatorship led by General Leopoldo Galtieri. The country was facing a serious economic crisis. Inflation was rising rapidly, unemployment was increasing, and protests against the military government were becoming more frequent. For many Argentines, one issue had always been tied closely to national pride: the Falkland Islands. Argentina refers to these islands as Las Malvinas and had claimed sovereignty over them for decades. However, the islands had been under British control since 1833. By early 1982, Argentina's military leaders believed that reclaiming the islands could strengthen their political position at home. They hoped that a successful military operation would unite the population and distract people from the economic crisis. The plan to seize the islands was called Operation Rosario. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces launched the operation. Amphibious troops and marine commandos landed near Port Stanley, the capital of the Falkland Islands. The objective was to capture the British administration quickly while avoiding heavy civilian casualties. At the time, the British defence on the islands was extremely small. Only about 80 Royal Marines were stationed there. Although they resisted the Argentine landing, they were heavily outnumbered. After several hours of fighting, the British governor, Sir Rex Hunt, ordered the garrison to surrender in order to prevent further bloodshed. Within a single day, Argentine forces took control of the islands. Port Stanley was renamed Puerto Argentino, and additional Argentine soldiers were flown in to reinforce the occupation. Argentina believed the operation had been a major success. Their leaders assumed Britain would protest diplomatically, but would not launch a large military campaign so far from home. That assumption would soon prove to be the critical miscalculation that shaped the entire war. The reaction in Britain was immediate and decisive. At the time, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher declared that the Falkland Islands would be recovered. The British government considered the invasion an attack on British territory and began preparing a military response almost immediately. Within days, the Royal Navy started assembling a large naval task force. Warships from across the fleet were ordered to sail toward the South Atlantic. The task force included destroyers, frigates, troop transport ships, and supply vessels that would keep the fleet operational during the long journey. 2 aircraft carriers became the centerpiece of the fleet: HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. These carriers carried Sea Harrier fighter jets that would provide air defense for the British fleet. Thousands of British soldiers were also deployed for the operation. These included units from the Royal Marines, the Parachute Regiment, and later the Scots Guards, Welsh Guards, and Gurkha soldiers. However, the greatest challenge Britain faced was distance. Falkland Islands were located nearly 13,000 kilometers from Britain. It meant the fleet had to cross the Atlantic Ocean and maintain supply lines across enormous distances. Fuel ships, ammunition carriers, and support vessels were essential to keeping the task force operational. Despite these difficulties, Britain succeeded in assembling one of the most complex expeditionary forces it had deployed since the Second World War. For Argentina's leaders, the speed and scale of this response came as a complete surprise. They had never expected Britain to react with such determination. Air power quickly became one of the most important elements of the Falklands War. Because Britain had no nearby air bases, its aircraft carriers were essential to the entire operation. Carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible carried Sea Harrier fighter jets that were responsible for protecting the fleet. The Sea Harrier had a unique advantage. It could take off from short runways and even directly from carrier decks using vertical or short takeoff capability. These aircraft were tasked with intercepting Argentine planes that attempted to attack the British fleet. Equipped with advanced Sidewinder missiles, Sea Harriers proved extremely effective in close-range air combat. Throughout the war, British pilots achieved multiple successful interceptions against Argentine aircraft. Remarkably, in air-to-air combat, Sea Harriers managed to shoot down several Argentine fighters without losing a single aircraft in dogfights. At the same time, the British Navy established a total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands. This meant that any Argentine ship or aircraft entering the zone could legally be attacked by British forces. This strategy significantly restricted Argentina's ability to reinforce its troops stationed on the islands. Gradually, British naval and air power began to dominate the surrounding waters. However, Argentina still had one powerful tool left in the fight: its air force. As the war progressed, the Argentine Air Force became the most aggressive element of Argentina's military effort. Argentine pilots launched their missions from air bases located on the mainland. However, the distance to the Falklands was extremely long for many of their aircraft. This meant pilots had limited fuel and very little time to search for targets before returning to base. To avoid detection by British radar, Argentine aircraft often flew at extremely low altitude over the ocean. This tactic was extremely dangerous but increased their chances of reaching British ships undetected. Despite these challenges, Argentine pilots carried out numerous attacks against the British fleet. The most dramatic incidents occurred on May 4, 1982. An Argentine aircraft launched an Exocet anti-ship missile toward a British destroyer. The missile struck HMS Sheffield, causing a massive fire that eventually led to the ship sinking. This attack shocked the British Navy and demonstrated the danger posed by Argentina's airstrikes. Several other British ships were also damaged or destroyed during similar attacks, including HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, and HMS Coventry. However, Argentine pilots faced a serious technical limitation. Because they had to release bombs at very low altitude, many of the bombs failed to arm properly and did not explode after hitting British ships. If those bombs had detonated correctly, the British fleet might have suffered much heavier losses. Even so, Argentine pilots continued their attacks with extraordinary courage, keeping the British fleet under constant pressure throughout the campaign. While aircraft battled above the ocean, another deadly contest was taking place beneath the waves. Britain deployed several nuclear-powered submarines to patrol the waters around the Falkland Islands. These submarines were extremely difficult to detect and could remain underwater for long periods of time. One of them, HMS Conqueror, would play a crucial role in the war. On May 2, 1982, Conqueror detected the Argentine cruiser ARA, General Belgrano, south of the Falklands. The British submarine fired a series of torpedoes. Two of them struck the cruiser, causing the catastrophic damage. Within a short time, the ship began to sink. More than 320 Argentine sailors lost their lives in the disaster. The sinking of the Belgrano had a major strategic impact. After losing one of its most important warships, Argentina withdrew most of its navy from the conflict. Argentine commanders feared that British submarines could destroy additional ships if they remained at sea. As a result, Britain gained strong control over the waters surrounding the Falkland Islands. After securing control of the surrounding seas, Britain moved to the next critical stage of the war, landing troops on the Falkland Islands. On May 21, 1982, British forces launched a major amphibious landing at San Carlos Water, located on the western side of East Falkland. The location was carefully chosen by British commanders. The narrow waterway and surrounding hills helped shield the landing force from Argentine radar and made it slightly harder for enemy aircraft to approach. However, once the landings began, Argentine forces quickly detected the operation. Almost immediately, Argentine aircraft launched a series of intense air attacks against the British ships supporting the landing. Fighter jets and attack aircraft repeatedly flew towards San Carlos and dropped bombs or fired missiles at the fleet. The number of attacks was so frequent that British sailors began referring to the area as Bomb Alley. Several British ships were heavily damaged during these attacks, and some were destroyed. Despite the constant danger, the British Navy and Marines continued the landing operation. Thousands of soldiers, along with vehicles, artillery, and large amounts of equipment, were successfully unloaded onto the islands. This was one of the most dangerous phases of the war, but it was also one of the most important. By the end of the operation, Britain had established a secure beachhead on East Falkland. With troops now firmly on the islands, British forces began preparing to move inland. Their ultimate objective was clear: advance across East Falkland and capture Port Stanley, capital of the islands. Once British troops had landed successfully, the conflict shifted from naval warfare to intense ground combat. Terrain of the Falkland Islands made military operations extremely difficult. The landscape was covered with rocky hills, muddy peat bogs, and very few roads. Soldiers often had to march long distances, carrying heavy equipment through cold, wet, and windy conditions. One of the first major ground battles occurred at Goose Green. On May 28th to 29th, 1982, British paratroopers from the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, launched an attack on Argentine defensive positions near the settlement. The battle lasted many hours and involved intense fighting. In the end, British forces succeeded in capturing Goose Green and took hundreds of Argentine soldiers prisoner. This victory gave British troops greater momentum as they continued advancing across East Falkland. In early June, attention turned toward the hills surrounding Port Stanley. Several important battles took place as British forces attempted to capture these strategic high positions. Among the most important were Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Mount Harriet, and Mount Tumbledown. These hills were extremely important because they overlooked Port Stanley and controlled access to the capital. Many of these battles were fought at night and involved close-range combat between infantry units. Usually, British troops captured these positions one by one. Mid-June, British forces had secured most of the high ground surrounding Port Stanley. The Argentine defenders were now under increasing pressure. By the middle of June 1982, British forces had taken control of nearly all the key high ground around Port Stanley. This placed the Argentine defenders in a very difficult position. The supply situation was deteriorating. Many soldiers were exhausted, and British artillery and infantry attacks were continuing to increase. Argentine commander on the islands, General Mario Menendez, realized that his forces were no longer able to hold the capital. Continuing the fight would likely lead to unnecessary casualties without changing the outcome of the war. On June 14, 1982, Menendez agreed to surrender to the British forces. That decision, the Falklands War officially came to an end. The conflict had lasted 74 days. British troops entered Port Stanley and the Falkland Islands returned to British administration. Although the war was relatively short, the human cost was significant. A total of 649 Argentine military personnel, 255 British service members, and 3 Falkland Island civilians lost their lives. The war also had major political consequences. In Argentina, the defeat severely weakened the military dictatorship and eventually led to the restoration of democratic government the following year. In Britain, the victory strengthened the political position of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Today, the Falklands War remains one of the most significant military conflicts of the late 20th century, demonstrating how geography, logistics, and strategic decisions can determine the outcome of a war. The British task force to move forward with the next phase of the war.